Adelante.
Ok, es un gusto bienvenir a todos a la última sesión del seminario de verano, del seminario permanente de filosofía de Teorema. En esta ocasión tenemos con nosotros a Sara Moss, profesora de la Universidad de Michigan en Ann Arbor. Sara ha sido profesora de esa universidad por muchos años y ha ganado varios premios, entre ellos el último premio que ha ganado ha sido el premio Sanders por su libro Conocimiento Probabilístico. La forma en la que vamos a tener esta reunión va a ser como la hemos tenido en veces anteriores. Sara va a estar presentando y la podemos interrumpir con preguntas. Si alguien tiene preguntas en castellano, or somebody has questions in English, se las pueden mandar a Gabriel Dumet, que está con el nombre preguntas. They can send them to Gabriel Dumet, who has the questions in his name. Y al final de la sesión vamos a tener espacio para preguntas adicionales. And at the end of the session we'll have time for additional questions. Entonces, con eso, le doy la palabra a la profesora Moss.
Great, thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here. So this talk is a talk in philosophy of language, but it's gonna address this major debate in epistemology, the debate over whether knowledge is subject to pragmatic encroachment. So just at the start, I'm going to take a few minutes to really lay out that debate. So a key example that we can use to set up the two sides in the debate over pragmatic encroachment. Let's say Oliver is in first grade and he's working at a bake sale for his school, and a customer walks up to buy some cookies. And Oliver says, "Oh, I looked at the labels. I know these cookies are chocolate and these have nuts, and I know these don't have nuts." And the customer says, "Do you really know that these cookies don't have nuts? Because sometimes bakers mix up their labels, and I'm allergic to nuts. If I eat a nut, I'm gonna die." So now it will sound bad for Oliver to say, "Oh yeah, I know those cookies don't have nuts." And so the debate is between the contextualists and the interest relative invariantists. And everyone agrees that Oliver's first self-ascription of knowledge, when he first said, "I know these don't have nuts," that was true. And his second self-ascription of knowledge, "Yeah, I know these cookies don't have nuts," was false. Now, the contextualist says that's because the denotation of the word knows changes in the discourse. The first ascription is true because it says that Oliver knows the cookies are nut-free, which he does. And the second ascription is false because it says that Oliver really knows for sure that the cookies are nut-free, which he doesn't. So meanwhile, the interest relative invariantist, the opposing side in the debate, says knows denotes the same relation throughout. And the knowledge ascription just becomes false because the facts change. So at first, Oliver does know the cookies are nut-free, and when the customer speaks, he loses that knowledge. So that phenomenon, according to the interest relativist, is called pragmatic encroachment, the idea being that, oh, what's practically at stake encroaches on what Oliver knows. So that, the background to this debate is really, I think, that contextualism was introduced as its way of responding to the skeptic. So the original bake sale happens in 1641, and Descartes says, "Oh, I know I have hands and eyes and flesh," and then asks himself, "Do I really know I have hands? After all, it might be an evil demon is deceiving me." And now it sounds bad for Descartes to say, "Yeah, I know I have hands." And so contextualism and also interest relativism, interest relative invariantism offer ways of saving ordinary knowledge ascriptions. They both get to say Descartes spoke truly when he initially said, "I know I have hands and eyes and flesh." And just they differ in, so they both succeed in responding to the skeptic in that way. And then they differ because for the contextualist, Descartes speaks truly because he wasn't yet using knows for a very strict relation. And for the interest relativist, it's just because Descartes wasn't yet interested in answering the skeptic initially. So that's the Cliff Notes background. Apologies to those of you who are super familiar with this debate, but that's the background on the debate that I'm entering. And I'm going to defend contextualism. So I'm going to present two challenges for this view that knowledge is subject to pragmatic encroachment. But before I actually present the challenges to the pragmatic encroachment view, I want to talk about, and this will be section 1 of the handout, about how to even define this thesis, knowledge is subject to pragmatic encroachment. Because as it turns out, I think there's a problem for how that thesis is usually defined, and that problem is going to turn out to be important for me. So now we're on the handout. There are, I feel like I should just pause in case anyone has a hand yet, but yeah, so that's all, that's throat clearing, that's my debate. So there are two common definitions of the pragmatic encroachment view, this claim, knowledge is subject to pragmatic encroachment. So in the literature, pretty much everyone's going to define encroachment either using a dependence claim or more specifically, a failure of supervenience claim. So these definitions are given by both the people who support encroachment and also people who deny encroachment. And also these dependence claims and failure of supervenience claims that I'm going to talk about, they're actually used to define not just pragmatic encroachment, so how practical interests encroach on knowledge. They're also used to define the thesis that practical interests encroach on what you're justified in believing, or on what it's rational for you to believe, or on what constitutes your evidence. So all of these kinds of ways in which the practical encroaches on the epistemic, people define them using dependence claims and failure of supervenience claims. And similarly, the claims are also, these two kinds of claims are used to define not just pragmatic encroachment, so the encroachment of practical states, but also moral encroachment. So the claim that like moral interests, for instance, encroach on knowledge. So I think the problem arises when we start to think about how do definitions like those in section 1 look to contextualists. So the dependence claim, for instance, so this is one on the handout, the pragmatic knowledge is subject to pragmatic encroachment can mean, people say, that whether someone knows that P can depend on their practical interests. And some people say, okay, look, we're familiar with dependence. I put 5 examples of that kind of dependence claim on the handout. And some people want to go one step farther. So this would be like the people cited in footnotes 7, 8, 9, and say, oh, I'll tell you, in fact, what that dependence amounts to. What I'm really saying is knowledge is subject to encroachment if and only if there's a pair of subjects such that one subject knows that P, the other doesn't know that P, and they differ only in their interests. So Brian Weatherson points out in one place that we need to add this little disclaimer that, hey, P isn't just a proposition about their interests. But with that little rider in place, 2 functions as a very popular definition of what it means for knowledge to be subject to encroachment. So why do I feel like definitions 1 and 2 really just don't cut it? We should stop using them to define encroachment. The problem is, well, let's imagine that you're a contextualist. Now, a lot of context-sensitive expressions exhibit pronoun-like behavior in sentences that contain whether, like in 1, or VP ellipsis, like in 2. So let's talk about, just to make that concrete, this really uncontroversially context-sensitive expression. Let's just talk about tall. So almost everyone agrees tall is context-sensitive. So Marie-Sophie Hinderman was a gymnast who was 5'7". She was the tallest female gymnast ever to compete in the Olympics. People would go up to Marie-Sophie as she's doing gymnastics and say, wow, you know, she's really tall. Spud Webb, also 5'7", one of the 10 shortest basketball players in NBA history. People would go to basketball games, look at Spud Webb and say, wow, he is really not tall. Now we can say, look, Marie Sophie was tall, Spud was short, even though they're both 5'7". And so we might say colloquially, oh yeah, like whether an athlete of a given height, 5'7", that height is tall, can depend on what sport they're in. Like, is it gymnastics or basketball? So this is an example of a context-sensitive expression exhibiting pronoun-like behavior. So the thought is, look, let's look at 3 on page 2 of the handout. Whether an athlete of a given height is tall can depend on what sport they play. And let's also, so that's tall having an implicit argument that's bound by the an athlete at the front of 3. Or similarly, let's look at 5 on page 2 of the handout. Look, the gymnast is tall, the basketball player isn't. And there's no difference in the height that they are, they're just different in what sport they play. So that's an example of VP ellipsis. What we're reading is the gymnast is tall for her sport, the basketball player isn't, and then what's elided is tall for his sport. And yet they differ only in, of course, what sport they play. So 3 and 5 come out true because tall is context sensitive. So it has that implicit argument that can shift depending on the athlete and their sport that's at issue. And so you could say, I think that 3 and 5, they make dependence claims, sure, but it's a kind of cheap dependence claim that whether an athlete who's 5'7" is tall depends on what sport they play. And you can contrast that with like a genuine dependence claim when I say, for instance, look, whether a plant is healthy can depend on whether you water it. And this plant is tall and this isn't, or I guess maybe I should have said that plant is healthy, this plant isn't. They differ only in whether you watered them. So there's a kind of deep dependence with no contextualist shifty standards going on, such that I just use healthy to extend this property, such that whether a plant has it, that single one property actually depends on whether you water it. So why does this translate into a problem for the use of 1 and 2 to define encroachment on knowledge? Well, here comes a contextualist who can say now, yeah, 1 and 2, sure, those claims are true. Like, I accept encroachment. I'm a contextualist. I think knows in 1 and 2 works just like tall works in 3 and 5. So just like we use tall to talk about multiple heights, we use knows to talk about multiple epistemic standards. And there's a bound reading of 1 that's like the bound reading of 3. And there's a sloppy pronoun reading of 2 that's like the sloppy pronoun reading of 5. So these definitions of encroachment, 1 and 2, they come out true, says the contextualist. Now, if you're a fan of pragmatic encroachment, you're gonna feel like this is just a bit of a cheat. And I think they should feel that way, the fans of encroachment. It seems like the clever contextualist is just vindicating the letter of encroachment, but not really the spirit of pragmatic encroachment, because encroachment is intended to be this deep dependence claim. Like, what you know for the encroacher really depends on what's at stake in just the same sense as what you know can depend on what evidence you have, or in just that deep sense that whether your plants are healthy depends on whether you water them, or whether a number is even depends on whether it's divisible by 2. So I think we need to wrap up section 1, better definitions of encroachment. So definitions that, oh, look, let's get some definitions such that the real interest relativists accept them and the clever contextualist will reject them. Yeah, so I saw a hand. Yeah, Jaime.
Yeah, so I was wondering how much you're relying on this example of tallness, because I don't remember the details right now. Like, I cannot present them, but there are like 4 different ways in which you can account for the context sensitivity, or like what seems to be context sensitivity in the case of gradable adjectives. And so I was wondering whether you have like another card that you can play if maybe it turns out that the best theory of gradable adjectives doesn't favor your view.
Yeah, good. So cards on the table, I feel like tall is a very bad template, like a bad model for the context sensitivity of nose. So I don't actually think that, I don't want to say that the way that tall works is just semantically like the way that nose works. What I do want to say is tall has a certain feature that nose also has, and then tall has a bunch of other additional features, like it deserves a degree semantics. So it's really genuinely gradable, like you can say is taller than, and maybe the comparative deserves the most fundamental semantic treatment, and you should understand just tall in terms of taller. None of that, I think, actually holds for nose. So I don't think we have some most fundamental nose more, better nose relation in terms of which nose simpliciter ought to be understood. So yeah, long story short, there are like analogies and disanalogies between tall and nose. And what I'm most interested in is just this one tiny analogy, the one that the clever contextualist is exploiting when they say, hey, I hear a true reading of 1 and 2. So yeah, does that help clarify where the dialectic is at this point?
Yeah, I think I get the general picture. I was just thinking about other potential examples, but I cannot really come up with any, because it probably doesn't work with like pure indexicals or.
Yeah, good. So
no, sorry, that was.
So basically you're thinking, oh, look, the pure indexicals don't exhibit this pronoun-like behavior. So we don't say, oh, the whether you ate breakfast today depends on what day it is. That's bad. So we don't bind pure indexicals in the same way that we bind the more pronominal elements. And so I think that's correct. I don't want to, so I think the sense in which tall and nose are similar that I care about in section 1 is a sense in which they are both dissimilar from pure indexicals. Yeah, for sure. And then, I mean, I think if you want other cases that aren't gradable adjectives that fit into this other category, like there's a lot of loose speech or like quantifier domain stuff where I think like whether, I mean, I guess it depends on what you think about like empty and whether that's a gradable adjective. I mean, emptier than, it seems like it works quite differently than tall. But yeah, like whether the fridge is empty depends on, I mean, actually, I think in colloquial English, you get things like whether the theater is full depends on who's asking. Like it can go super metalinguistic. So there's a certain sense in which like, I think we're constantly sort of exploiting that phenomenon, but that might be something a little bit different. Yeah, I feel like I'm rambling, but so basically, yeah, maybe this isn't so interesting, but if you just come up with a list of your favorite context sensitive expressions, some but not all of them will exhibit this behavior. Mostly pure indexicals are special because they don't. And inevitably, like if you're modeling it with an implicit argument that's like a pronoun at logical form, that pronoun will end up exhibiting this behavior because all this is just like binding and sloppiness.
Yeah, I think, sorry, this is going to be my last comment, but I don't know if maybe I might not know enough, but I just feel like once you move away from pure indexicals, things become really, really messy. So I'm kind of So I don't feel like totally convinced about drawing this kind of analogies in such muddy waters, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think part of what started me on this project is that I noticed that a lot of people kept saying, whether you count as knowing depends on what the stakes are. And so this intuitive pull to talk in terms of whether you count as knowing is very similar to a kind of intuitive pull that people use with terms where they're interpreted relative to like a contextually determined standard of precision. Like, oh, does she count as tall? Well, I don't know. Tell me, is she a gymnast or a basketball player? So I think standards of precision, they just work so differently from pure indexicals, but we don't say, oh, does it count as today? That doesn't make sense. Or, oh, whether the plant counts as healthy can depend on whether you water it. Well, actually, I mean, you can say that, but that doesn't mean, I mean, basically what you're doing is exploiting the fact that healthy itself is a little bit vague and may be interpreted relative to contextually salient standards. So, yeah, so I feel like there are these kind of independent reasons to abandon the admittedly most elegant theory that knows is going to work like a pure indexical. Yeah. Because it just seems like it works closer to terms that are get other semantic treatments. I feel like Eduardo has his hand up.
Thank you.
Yeah, so very quick clarificatory question. So I want to know exactly what you mean by what's the difference between the cheap claim and the deep claim? So because in your example 3, tall can depend on what sport they play. In your example 4, the plant is healthy, can depend on whether you water it, but also you can say that, so suppose we are colonizing Mars and we have these plants there, and given the environment, this plant is healthy, but if the standards are the ones on Earth, this plant is not healthy. So I'm not so sure I'm grasping the difference between the cheap claim and the deep claim.
Yeah, good. So part of what's noisy is that healthy is context sensitive. And so there's a certain kind of cheap dependence claim that you can make that starts whether a plant is healthy can depend on. Now, that's not the cheap dependence claim that's being made by 4. 4 is a deep one, but the one that you just uttered was a cheap dependence claim. Theoretically, what's going on is a dependence claim is cheap if there's substantive binding of the implicit argument of healthy going on. So healthy for this environment depends on what environment it's in. So the for its environment, the it is being bound by the a plant at the beginning of the sentence. And that's why it counts for me as a cheap claim. Now, you might think, so then there's this other question you can ask though, which is, hey, wait, why not just say that, oh, I don't care, cheap or deep, like pragmatic encroachment. Why don't we just identify it with any kind of dependence? And so that actually is more getting on towards how I would prefer to distinguish pragmatic encroachment from the contextualist view, which is sort of 7 and 8 in section 2 of the handout. So if that was kind of your, hey, wait, why don't you count the clever contextualist as a pragmatic encroachment fan? That answer is like, stay tuned. Yeah, does this, am I answering the question that you had in mind though?
Yeah, thanks. I'll wait for the
Okay.
part.
Okay, cool. So without further
can
ado,
I ask a quick
yeah.
question? Sorry.
Mhm.
Is this contextualist and evidentialist?
Can you just define evidentialism as you're using
Yeah,
it?
so yeah, I was mentioning evidentialism because sometimes this debate of pragmatic encroachment is introduced as some sort of antithesis of evidentialism, where evidentialism is a supervenience claim in which epistemic justification supervenes solely on evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And the encroacher is like a denial of evidentialism in that sense.
Yeah, good. Okay, so a lot of people will say, look, I can be an encroacher without, so I think these are orthogonal. So because one question is, when you say what you're justified in believing depends on your evidence, it might be that, yeah, that still holds. And also what counts as evidence for you depends on the stakes, in addition to what you're justified in believing depends on the stakes.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're like a super deep encroacher, then you can hang on to evidentialism. You won't really scratch the itch of what the evidentialists wanted when they were going around saying that. But yeah, and but also you're welcome to stop and say, no, there's this thing that's evidence such that that's not subject to encroachment, but justification is. And so then I'm an encroacher who does deny evidentialism.
Yeah, I was thinking more about like this, this kind of evidentialism where evidence is something that is like true conductive or something like that. So it's not related to pragmatic or practical stakes.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically, you know, I started out my philosophical career at Oxford. So I've got this little like E equals K troll sitting on my shoulder at all times that makes me just, you know, want to respect the fact that some people are going to think that if K is subject to encroachment, then E will also be subject to encroachment. But I think you're totally right. Like if you know, if you don't have that troll on your shoulder, then I think this is, yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to know exactly how you were defining evidentialism. But I think often the encroacher and the evidentialist are seen as being at odds.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I asked this because, I mean, if the initial difficulty was to contrast like contextualism and pragmatic encroachment, I thought maybe you can just say that the contextualist is the one that accepts evidentialism and the encroacher is the one that rejects evidentialism. So you don't have to like spend more time like trying to define what's the right way of characterizing this idea of pragmatic encroachment.
Right. But I have this hunch that both pragmatic encroachment fans, so the interest relative invariantist and the contextualist, could each go either way on evidentialism.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for trying though. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think fundamentally, like, contextualism is supposed to be this claim that knows can denote these different properties in different contexts. So part of why I think no one in the literature has really realized that 1 and 2 are bad definitions of interest relativism is because almost all the interest relativists in the literature are actually invariantists. So you have a bunch of people throwing around IRI as, well, that's my view. I'm an interest relative invariantist. And then, well, okay, like if you're an invariantist, then you don't think that knows is context sensitive. Right. And it exhibits all this binding behavior. And so 1 and 2 have this cheap reading. You don't get into any of that trouble. And so you don't need to really worry about this clever contextualist character I've introduced coming in and then vindicating 1 and 2, but for the wrong reasons. So I think most interest relativists are invariantists, and so they reject contextualism by definition, because that's the invariantist part of their view.
Right.
And then what we've seen in philosophy is that people are increasingly interested in just encroachment claims simpliciter, who don't care too much about whether contextualism is correct, but are really interested. You see this a lot in the moral encroachment literature, I think.
Right.
People are really actually focused on encroachment as a thesis. And so now that we've got, you know, someone who's like a moral encroachment fan, they have the kind of IR, where the I is moral interests. They want to be IR theorists, but they don't care about the second I, the invariantism. And so now we need this definition that's going to work for these people.
Right.
And that's what I want to spell out. Like, so yeah, then that's taking us to section 2. Like, what do we say once invariantism isn't just presupposed? If we want to say, oh, I'm an advocate of pragmatic encroachment, and that means, yeah.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Thank
So
you.
So just I feel like I've built this up too much. I mean, I think what they should say is, so this is 7 on the handout, that look, just fix the context and then look at the property that knows that P denotes. So that property, whether someone has it, can depend on her interests. So that's the kind of deep dependence claim. Now we're talking about the property is just depending on the interests. You're going to lose or gain the property depending on your interests, depending on the stakes going up and down. And so similarly, so that's the actual dependence claim that I think is a little bit more responsible, because the real fan of encroachment, this is what they wanted. They wanted the relation of knowing to be such that whether you bear it to a proposition depends on your interest. So just fix the relation of knowing that's denoted by knows that P at a context. Or similarly, if you want a responsible analog of the failure of supervenience claim, you should say, okay, look, out of context knows that P can denote this property such that somebody has it and somebody else doesn't, and the only difference in them is in their interest. And now you see that we have avoided the analog of, oh, the gymnast is tall and the basketball player isn't, and they only differ in what sport they play, because it's not the case that there is a given height property, namely being however tall, such that one of them has it and the other doesn't, and they only differ in what sport they play. Like the height property is 5'7", and they've both got that. It's not true that one of them has it and the other one doesn't. Or just pick another height property. Well, okay, neither of them has it. So they differ in what sport they play, but there's no height property one has and the other doesn't. So that's the kind of way for, I think, the true interest relativist to really nail down a definition that doesn't land them with their view being cheaply vindicated by this like clever contextualist character. Yeah. So as you might guess by the fact that I'm calling them the clever contextualists, like clever contextualism is the version of contextualism that I want to defend. So, so the next goal is just going to be to define that particular view more precisely. So if contextualism is just this general view that knows is context sensitive, then as we already alluded to, really, you know, as Jaime was pointing out, like there are 4 different, or I mean, probably 40 different kinds of context sensitive expressions. So this view that knows is context sensitive leaves open a lot of options about how exactly knows works. And so you can just usefully divide epistemologists by saying, okay, like what context sensitive expressions do they use as their semantic model for knows? And so De Rose and Michael Bloem-Tillman have the Jaime view that knows works like pure indexicals in the sense of Kaplan 89. And then Unger and Cohen would say nose works like a gradable adjective. David Lewis and Jonathan Ichikawa would pull on more quantificational determiners. So like every, which can, or, you know, everyone waved to everyone. So everyone can denote different sets of people in those different positions in the sentence. And then Jonathan Schaffer and Zoltan Sabo have a more recent paper where they argue that nose is like an A quantifier. So the word always, for instance, can mean different things in different contexts. Like when Paulo goes to the base to see a baseball game, he always gets popcorn, or he usually gets popcorn. So that usually is being restricted over like the events of going to a baseball game. Most of those are popcorn events. So, you know, some but not all of those expressions give rise to these bound variable like readings. So some but not all contextualists accept binding on the handout. So this is in the middle of section 2 on page 2. So nose can give rise to these bound variable like readings. It's not like DeRose thinks it is a pure indexical. So let's just say, okay, a contextualist is clever, just in case they're a contextualist and they accept binding. And then let's say the simple contextualist accepts the elegant view that, look, nose is just a pure indexical. It works like I, here, now, today, and it's not subject to bound variable like readings. So it's more like today in the sentence, whether I had breakfast today depends on what day it is. That doesn't have a true reading. So it used to be that most epistemic contextualists were simple. And actually, I was reading this Jason Stanley paper from 2000, where he was just pointing out that all these leading proponents of contextualism were treating no as a pure indexical. But I think that if I had to characterize the literature, I think we're moving in the direction generally of clever contextualist views. And that's the kind of contextualism that I want to defend. So I'm going to give 2 arguments for contextualism. And I think each of those arguments favors clever contextualism over 2 rival views. First, the major opponent, interest relative invariantism, and second, the opponent in the, as it were, you know, primary election, the simple contextualist view. Okay, so 2 arguments, each works against 2 rivals. And there's one character I'm not going to talk about. So before I give the arguments, I'm just going to flag that I'm not going to talk that much about skeptical invariantism. So this is actually the original Unger view, where we say, okay, look, I'm an invariantist about nose, and I think it works like maximal absolute gradable adjectives like flat. And I just think flat and nose are these instances of loose speech. So they're context sensitive because standards of precision for loose speech are context sensitive. But I actually think all loose speech is just literally false. So nothing's really flat. All the nose claims are also literally false. Nose in every context just denotes a very strict relation. So ordinary knowledge descriptions are false. So skeptic wins. And so even though I think you're an invariantist about flat, that invariantist, I think that kind of invariantist that I just sketched, the one who thinks, oh yeah, flat is loose speech and all loose speech is just strictly speaking false, but we could still use loose speech to convey claims that are true. It's just that literally they're all false claims. So that kind of person actually does accept binding in my sense. Like I think that the skeptical invariantist can say, oh yeah, nose gives rise to bound variable like readings, because it's just like somebody who says, oh, every kid in shop class made a flat table, where that means the first graders made a table that was, yeah, like reasonably flat, and the 6th graders made a table that was very flat. So that's a bound variable reading if you have different standards of flatness for the different grades of kids in shop class. So you could say that conveys that kids of different grades made tables of different flatness standards. And so flat can give rise, even if Unger is correct, to a bound variable like reading. It's just that that bound variable meaning is conveyed, but it's not the literal truth of all those flat claims is just like false, nothing's really flat. So I hope this isn't too much TMI, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I think there's a kind, and really, I think it was, Gillian Russell was attracted to skeptical invariantism, and she just encouraged me to point out that I'm gonna ask Gillian and Unger to really like exit the stage. I'm not arguing against that particular view. I'm more arguing against the interest relative invariantist who is like Jason Stanley, Brian Weatherson, John Hawthorne, those kinds of interest relative invariantists who want to vindicate ordinary knowledge ascriptions. And then I also am arguing again against like the simple contextualist, so keep the rows. So that's enough people for me to pick fights with. And early Unger we can just save. I don't know. Okay, so now I'm up to the arguments, section 3. And so I'm on page 3 of the handout. Okay. So again, I want to talk just a bit about the adjective tall by way of setting up an analogy for the argument I want to build using nose. The reason, by the way, that I picked tall is not, as I explained, because I think it's like the ideal template for the correct semantics for nose, but actually because there's a certain debate about what's called Bo-Jackson judgments for the gradal adjective tall. And that debate, I think, can be usefully replayed in the key of knowledge ascriptions. So let's distinguish these two views about tall. So the contextualist about tall says that tall denotes different properties in different contexts. So one property when we're talking about gymnasts, another property when we're talking about basketball players. And then let's say that we have another opposing view, the sports relative invariantist about tall, who says tall denotes the same property in all contexts, invariantly. It applies to an athlete roughly if and only if she's tall for a player of her sport. So now we can have this debate between the contextualist and the sports relative invariantist. And actually some theorists have defended this sports relative invariantist line about tall. But in my view, there are just data in the literature that settle this debate. And those data are the Bo-Jackson judgments. So they're judgments about quantified tall ascriptions. So the contextualist is going to win. And here's why. First of all, let's just talk to this kind of naive sports relative invariantist view who says, oh yeah, is tall applies to X just in case X is tall by the standard of the sports that she plays. There's this immediate problem, which I'm sure half of you are grappling with already, which is, hey, wait, like some people play multiple sports. So the real Bo-Jackson played baseball and football. And I think he was the only professional athlete in history to get like to be an all-star in both sports. So that was why this became the Bo-Jackson problem, because Bo-Jackson plays two sports with different standards of tallness. Now, unfortunately, I actually think baseball and football, the height standards are not actually that different. So I looked this up. The average height of a Major League Baseball player is 6'1". The average height of an NFL player is 6'2". So forget this. Like, instead of making you remember which is which, I'm just going to introduce this fictional character. Okay, so Bo Schmackson. This guy competes in both gymnastics and basketball. Great, this is very easy to remember. In the morning, Bo Schmackson's gymnastics coach tells him, oh, Bo's tall. And in the afternoon, his basketball coach says, Bo is not tall. So Bo plays 2 sports. Bo is tall is true in the morning. Bo is not tall is true in the afternoon. This makes trouble for just this naive sports relative invariantist view, right? Like tall applies to Bo just in case he's tall by the standards of what sport he plays. Hey, wait, he plays 2 sports. He's tall by the standards of one and not the other. What the heck? So revision, like a smart sports relative invariantist will be undaunted. They will say, no, 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 no. We want tall to refer to a temporary intrinsic property. So being tall is just this property that you can gain or lose depending on what sport you happen to be playing. So the smart sports relative invariantist says, Bo is tall when he does gymnastics, and he's not tall when he's playing basketball. As soon as he starts playing basketball, he loses that tallness property that he had. So now we have tall, you can think of its denotation as this invariant set of temporal slices of objects. So as uttered in any context, the extension of tall is going to contain the morning time slice of Bo Schmackson and not the afternoon time slice of Bo Schmackson. So you can see why I'm introducing this smart sports relative invariantist, because actually, like, look, they're doing for tall exactly what the interest relative invariantists are doing for nose. So the problems, I mean, I think it's easier to see in the case of tall. This seems like not the greatest theory. It seems like a way of sort of putting a band-aid on a problem, the problem being that people play multiple sports. The problems for the sports relative invariantist, even when they make this smart modification, oh, tall refers to a temporary intrinsic property, the problems continue. So first of all, I actually didn't put this problem in the handout, but I think there's a certain problem where we have simultaneous utterances, tallness descriptions. So let's suppose the gymnastics coach goes home, sits down at her dinner table and says, I've got this guy that I'm coaching, Bo Schmackson, and he's tall. It's 6 p.m. You have a basketball coach who goes home, sits down to eat dinner. It's 6 p.m. The basketball coach says, I've got this guy on my team, Bo Schmackson, he's not tall. So they both simultaneously utter, Bo is tall, Bo is not tall at 6 p.m. And the question is, okay, you know, they're both making this claim about how Bo is at 6 p.m., tall or not tall. Now, if you're interested in explaining why one of the coach could truly say Bo's tall in the morning and another can say Bo's not tall truly in the afternoon, they intuitively can both be right. If you're interested in really vindicating that judgment, I subject to you, you should be equally interested in explaining why the coach who goes home to dinner and says Bo's tall and the other coach who goes home to dinner and says Bo's not tall intuitively both make true utterances, which just happen to be simultaneous instead of split up into different times. So the problem is, in order to predict that each of these utterances has a true reading, Bo has to, at the dinner hour, count as both tall and not tall. It doesn't work to vindicate both of these readings of the simultaneous utterances to like say that, oh, tallness is a temporary intrinsic property. So that's one problem for even the smart sports relative invariantist. And another problem is 11 on the handout. You get a problem when it comes to these quantified tallness ascriptions. So this was actually the quantified ascription, the one on the handout was the one that was originally called the Bo Jackson problem by Jason Stanley in 2005. So the point Jason made was, look, let's just tell a little bit of a backstory And then we'll get a sentence that's true, but the sports relative invariantist just can't explain why. So the backstory is that if Beau's on the gymnastics team and the basketball team, so he's a tall gymnast, he's a short basketball player, and he's the only tall gymnast on the gymnastics team. So the gymnastics team has exactly one tall person, and it's Beau. And of course, Beau is a short basketball player, but his friend Mo is a really tall basketball player, and he's the only one on the team. So there's only one basketball player who's tall, and it's Beau's friend Mo. All right, so we have every sports team at community high, their school, has exactly one tall member, because after all, the gymnastics team has one tall member, Beau, the basketball team has one tall member, Mo. Now, the sports relative invariantist, unfortunately, cannot just vindicate this, this simple looking ascription. So intuitively, what we're saying is, hey, look, every sports team has one person who's tall by the standards of that sport, whatever sport the team is for. And the sports relative invariantist, remember, has to say, no, once you tell me this guy Beau, once you fix on him at a time, either he counts as tall or he doesn't. There's no implicit argument for tall for every sports team to be binding in 11. So the vindication of 11, I think, is the kind of data that really decisively favors the contextualist view of tall over the sports relative invariantist view. The idea is, because you say tall in 11 to mean tall by the standards of their sport, you need an implicit argument of tall that's being bound by every sports team out front. And that implicit argument's what gets really filled in by context in unquantified sentences. So that's the game, that's the uncontroversial, I think, dialectic that really convinces us that, yeah, you should just go ahead and be a contextualist about tall. And now what I want to do is give you the same kind of dialectic that convinces you, oh yeah, we should just all be like contextualists about nose. So the backstory will be, so I have to set up this analog of what I called varsity athlete, where you have Beau and Mo and gymnasts and basketball teams. So it does take a bit of work to set up these examples, because it's a non-trivial LF of a sentence in 11. So bear with me. So the backstory is, let's say that for fun, this character Beau just takes a home blood type test. And I looked on Amazon, you can buy these apparently for $7.30. And it comes in a nice package that says, know your blood type on it. So, he takes the test, he reads the package, he's like, oh yeah, I know my blood type. Great, I'm type O. And then later he goes to the hospital, maybe to get some vaccine. And I don't know, some new vaccine that's being COVID vaccine, or there's some trial for it. And when he arrives, he's assigned this intake nurse who's just collecting data, and then also a vaccination nurse who's going to give him the shot. And while he's waiting, the intake nurse mentions, oh, by the way, like the local blood bank is really short on type O blood. So, do you know your blood type? And he says, yeah, actually, I took this kit. I have type O blood. What? Great. The intake nurse makes sure, okay, visit the blood drive in the lobby before you leave, because they really need type O. And let's suppose, every time the nurse asks any other patient this, they're all just clueless about their blood type. Like Beau's the only one who actually knows his blood type, because luckily for her, he took this home test kit. So she's the analog of the gymnastics coach. She says to herself, yeah, Beau knows his blood type. Great. have one patient who knows his blood type. Now, a few minutes later, intake nurse goes out, vaccination nurse comes in and says, oh, Mr. Bowe, do you know your blood type? Mr. Schmackson, do you know your blood type? Blood type. And again, he says, oh yeah, like I took a home test kit that told me I have type O blood. And the vaccination nurse says, wait a minute, like she's thinking to herself, look, a patient's blood type determines which strain of the vaccine they receive. And if I give a non-type O blood type vaccine to a type O patient or vice versa, if we mix up this blood type, then he could have some fatal reaction to the strain that I'm going to produce in him. So, you know, we really need to know his blood type. And this guy, you know, he thinks he knows his blood type, but those test kits, they're ridiculous. They malfunction all the time. Like, what is a test kit that was sold on Amazon? Really? Like, there could be a billion things that went wrong, where this guy actually does not have type O blood. Like, we don't know what type of blood he has. And so the stakes are super high. She orders a hospital blood test for Bowe. And in fact, let's just suppose she does this for every single one of her patients, except for maybe one who really did get directly transferred from a blood transfusion ward. So she got the charts for that one person who did actually know for sure their blood type. So the vaccination nurse, just to review, says, yeah, like this guy who's gonna die if he's not type O, like he doesn't know his blood type, he doesn't know that he's O. And the intake nurse says Bowe does know his blood type. So now we have already, I actually didn't put this on my handout, but already just a simple argument that an interest relative invariantist can't vindicate the simultaneous utterances by these two nurses. Nurse one, Bowe knows his blood type. Nurse two, Bowe doesn't know his blood type. If they both go home and say at 6 o'clock at the dinner table to their family, I had this patient, Bowe Schmackson, he thinks he knows his blood type, he doesn't, or he actually knows his blood type, it's so great that he bought a test kit. We would want to vindicate their simultaneous utterances, their knowledge ascriptions, their ascription of knowledge and denial of knowledge for Bowe. But an interest relative invariantist can't vindicate the simultaneous utterances of a knowledge ascription and its negation. Because again, the whole shtick with interest relative invariantism was supposed to be that, okay, knowledge is just this relation, and whether you have it depends on the kind of room you're in and the kind of nurse you're talking to. So you can gain and lose knowledge depending on what nurse you're interacting with. But if both nurses are making simultaneous utterances about you, only one gets to be right. So that's the analog of the first dinner table problem for the sports relative invariantist about tall. And then there's also an analog of the more traditional Bowe-Jackson problem for the sports relative invariantist about tall. And that is if there's just some third person. So let's say it's like the hospital staff psychologist who is thinking, wow, nurses are under such stress recently. And really, I think I'm going to study whether some of that is exacerbated when nurses are just talking to patients who are really ignorant about just the most basic facts of healthcare. And so a nurse enters the lunchroom and the psychologist says, how's your current caseload? And the intake nurse and the vaccination nurse say, yes, I mean, we're working with these patients who barely know anything. And the intake nurse says, I just had one patient who knew his blood type today. And the vaccination nurse says, really? Oh, I just had one patient who knew his blood type today. And each of them are very stressed to be having to treat all of these patients, none of whom know their blood type. So then we think, like, as a staff psychologist writing down each nurse is stressed, that psychologist writes, each nurse had exactly one patient who knows, right now they are still, interacting with all these patients. Each nurse has only one patient who knows their blood type. So that sentence is the analog of every sports team has exactly one tall member. Every nurse has exactly one patient who knows their blood type, knows by the standard relevant for that nurse's job. So just like before we said, every sports team has exactly one member who's tall by the standards relevant for that sport. So that 14 on the handout, so on page 4 of the handout, is the bound reading that cannot be generated by the interest relative invariantist about nose. And of course, can also not be generated by somebody who thinks nose works like a pure indexical. So if you're keep the rows and you're a simple contextualist and you think nose can't be bound at all, then you're not going to start generating bound readings of 14. Contrast, clever contextualism, this view that I like says, yeah, great. Who knows, by her standards, their blood type is a perfectly fine thing to say. 14, we can vindicate that. We don't have to worry about explaining away some ordinary use of sentences like that, or in general, just cases where we see the implicit argument of nose being bound by higher quantifiers. All right, so I feel like I should just take a tiny break since that was a very long section. That's the first argument. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I had a clarificatory question. So I was having trouble wrapping my head around which parts of these are like arguments about language and how our use of expressions like no are about, and which parts are like more substantive claims about no. So I guess between the simple contextualist and the elegant contextualist, that clearly seems to be like a fight about language, but I'm less clear on the fight between contextualism and interest process.
Yeah, good. So it's interesting because there's a certain sentence that I think is true, and if you hold a certain view of knowledge itself, like if you're an interest relative invariantist who says, look, I think the kind of dependence at issue is really deep dependence, then it's almost like you're going to fail to vindicate a bunch of cheap readings that we see people using, because you think that, look, knowledge is this thing that just deeply depends on stakes. That's how I'm going to tell my story about the original Oliver cookie example. I'm going to start appealing to a bunch of deep dependence claims to explain that. And then I come along and say, okay, but wait a minute. It does look like there's a kind of binding behavior that goes on that can vindicate like cheap readings, I mean, bound readings of 14. And so the pressure is, hey, look, you need to say that nose has an implicit argument that's being bound in 14. And so once you admit that you're that kind of contextualist, you'll be on board with saying that pragmatic encroachment will get like cheap dependence readings vindicating it. So you no longer, what this does, I think, is it removes any motivation for addressing the Oliver example by appealing to some kind of deep dependence of knowledge on stakes. Let's see, I don't know if that like helps at all. Like, I feel like this is a very good like this is a good kind of subtle question. Like there's a certain sense in which like you could think, well, yeah, like I'm really into both cheap and deep dependence. But I think the idea is that, look, a contextualist says, the clever contextualist says that nose has this argument that's routinely bound, that it works like tall. And so if you're on board with this kind of section 3 argument that, oh yeah, nose works like tall, then when you go back to like 1, 3, and 4, for example, and you try to decide between the cheap and deep dependence hypotheses, you'll think, oh yeah, like 1 is true because it means the same kind of thing as 3, as opposed to what the interest relative invariantist wants you to think, which is that it means the same thing as 4.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to think of like, I don't know if this makes sense, but I can imagine the invariantist saying like, okay, fine. So there's not this particular linguistic evidence for my story, but maybe pragmatics can take care of that. And I have like independent motivation, whatever that would be, for my deep dependence claim. And so maybe language sometimes doesn't capture deep dependence, right? But I mean, too bad for language, right? I was trying to think of like that kind of, yeah.
Yeah, good. I mean, part of this is interesting because I think there is this other, I see interest relative invariantist as having these 2 motivations, both of which I want to address and neither of which I've really talked about yet. So one motivation, which I'm going to talk about in section 4, is they just say, hey, look, like here's a case. I found some people. There's like Ankita and Boyan, and one knows and the other doesn't, and they differ only in their interests. So look, I just really like my view that I'm just proving knowledge is interest relative. So I think one needs to address that motivation, actually. I don't think my job is over till I've undermined it, which I do want to do. And then there's another thought that's another kind of deep driver of fans of encroachment, I think, where they feel like there's a kind of knowledge action link, where what you know really affects what you may or should do in a situation. Like you can only act on reasons that are knowledge or something. Like they have all these different knowledge action connection principles. And then they think your action, what you should do, depends on the stakes. Therefore, what you know depends on the stakes. And so that's actually another really powerful motivation for the kind of interest relative view, which I also don't think works. So that's kind of what so I promise that in section 5, I also want to address that motivation. So I think this is, I mean, it's helpful to like pause here in the dialectic and think, well, look, we have one data point, but without showing that the clever contextualist can be responsive to the original motivations for the encroacher, I don't think that I would have that exciting of a paper just by saying, oh yeah, by the way, like Bo Jackson is a point in favor of clever contextualism. Yeah.
Okay, awesome, thanks. I don't know if you would like us to take a 3-minute break or something like that.
It's so funny.
Okay.
It literally was actually just like, I wonder if I could go to the bathroom. Yeah, actually, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Awesome. So we'll be back at 11 past the hour. Does that make sense? Awesome.
Yeah, thanks. So section 4, so additional patterns involving found readings. So remember, when I initially talked about the clever contextualist and the interest relative invariantist, the interest relative invariantist was endorsing the deep readings of the dependence claims, the dependence claim 1, and the clever contextualist was endorsing a cheap reading of that claim. So the contextualist compared 1 and 3, and the interest relative invariantist compares 1 and 4. So you might ask, well, look, can we just get some grip on whether a dependence claim is cheap or deep by directly diagnosing it in some way? So here's my observation in this vein. Cheap dependence claims are not naturally translated into change of state claims. So if I say, hey, basketball player, do you want to become tall? I'll tell you how to become tall. Take up gymnastics. Quit basketball, join gymnastics team. That sounds like a joke. So 16 on the handout, that's bad. The hashtag means infelicitous. Similarly, it's odd to say, oh, the surgeon's hands became clean when the operation was canceled. Or, hey, there was this batter and it became lumpy when we started using it for crepes instead of pancakes. So those don't sound great. Compare, oh, do you want your plants to become healthy? Start watering them. That sounds fine. So you could ask, all right, well, if we have these two kinds of dependence claims, cheap and deep, and then cheap claims just sound quite bad when we start translating them into change of state claims. How does it sound when we take a knowledge description and translate it into a change of state claims? What happens when I say, hey, do you want to gain some knowledge? Just start caring less. That sounds bad. So, hey, do you want Oliver to know whether this cookie has nuts in it? Then cure the customer of her fatal nut allergy, and then he'll gain some knowledge. Or do you want Bo to know that he has type O blood? Well, then just get a better vaccine that works for all blood types. Or do you want Hannah to know that the bank is open tomorrow? Oh, just pay off her mortgage behind her back. Then she'll gain some knowledge. So it's routinely observed as actually this, yeah, I mean, people really for decades have been beating this drum as an argument against interest relativism. So this is all the crew cited in footnote 17, that the change of state claims sound especially bad. So I think that is a legitimate strike against an interest relative invariantist, because they compare the deep dependence of starting to know with deep dependence of a plant starting to be healthy. But it seems to work in a cheap way. Now, the dialectic thickens, the plot thickens. At the same time, I think we have an opposing argument that's part of what motivated the interest relativists in the first place. So as I was mentioning to Narit, I think some interest relativists simply look at particular examples and they say, look, even though it seems bad in the abstract to say, oh yeah, you can gain knowledge by caring less or lose knowledge because the stakes went up, when you're describing a specific case, those failure of supervenience claims, the ones that go A knows, B doesn't, the only difference is in their interest, those actually can, in a very concrete case, start to sound better. So just forget the abstract claims like want to gain knowledge, start caring less, like 15. Focus on particular examples like, this is an example from Pinillos, Ankita and Boyan have coincidentally written word for word identical papers, and they check them over typos in exactly the same way. And then Boyan spends an additional minute checking his paper. And now let's specify a typo in this paper makes no difference to Ankita, but for Boyan, the stakes are very high. So as it happens, the papers don't have any typos. Now, the claim about this particular concrete case is that even though in the abstract it can sound bad to say, oh yeah, it can turn out that A knows something and B doesn't, and B has even better evidence than A. It can sound fine to say, look, in this case, Ankita knows this paper has no typos. Boyan doesn't know it. And Boyan has better evidence than Ankita. So if 18b sounds good, it looks like this is a good case. This is a good reason to accept that knowledge can be this relation such that Ankita bears it towards this proposition, Boyan doesn't, and Boyan has better evidence. This is something that people have usually trotted for. Yeah, sorry, I guess the way to put it is, this is something that interest relativists have usually cited as a really compelling reason to be an interest relativist about knowledge. So, I mean, Brian Weatherson actually uses this particular case in his paper that's arguing for interest relativism. Weatherson defines interest relativism using the failure of supervenience claim. So he says, yeah, look, I'm going to defend IRI, interest relative invariantism, and I'm just going to do it by proving that it's true. IRI says knowledge fails to supervene, and 18b is an example which proves that whether you know the paper has typos fails to supervene on your evidence. So, or I mean, actually we could tweak it so that they have the same evidence to get the failure of supervenience claim. So that's actually a point. 18b unanswered is a point in favor of interest relative invariantism. So combined with these initial judgments that I gave about 15 through 17, it looks like when we reflect around at ordinary language claims, maybe, you know, section 4 ends up being this stalemate. So we've got 1 point for the contextualist who assimilates correctly 15 and 16. And we've got 1 point for the interest relativist because they explain why 18b sounds okay. So actually, I think, no, it's not a stalemate. Actually, the situation is 2 points for the clever contextualist. And that's because we can observe that the contextualist about tall, for instance, can explain that when we focus on very concrete cases, the failure of supervenience forms, the LF of sentences like 19b, those can actually generate true sentences. So a contextualist about tall says, it does sound weird in the abstract to say, oh yeah, by the way, you can have somebody A who's tall and B who's not tall, and B is actually taller than A is, so the tall person's taller than the not tall person. Maybe that does sound a little awkward in the abstract, but once you fill in the details and say, yeah, there can be these two people, Mary Sophie, the gymnast who's tall, Spud, the basketball player, Spud Webb isn't tall, and Spud is taller than Maria Sophie. Well, look, actually, that doesn't sound so bad. And we can explain why. As contextualists about tall, we should expect 19b to sound better than 19a. And that's because, look, if you're gonna use tall twice in a sentence, like you do in 19a and 19b, so use it tall because you're saying Maria Sophie is tall, Spud isn't tall, so the second and first occurrence of tall. If you're gonna use it twice and interpret it relative to two different standards, then you need to do some pragmatic work to make each of those standards salient. That's not normal that you shift standards mid-sentence. So you need to really have something salient to you, like Marie Sophie's a gymnast and so on. And then once you make that salient, you make it possible to interpret 19b as true. It's quite clear what the standard should be for our interpretation of the first occurrence of tall, and then similarly for the distinct standard used to interpret the second occurrence. So the clever contextualist about knows says, oh, now similarly, you should very well expect that 18b can sound fine, and that in fact 18b will often sound much better than 18a. So why? Well, for the same reason that 19b sounds better than 19a, once you actually tell this whole backstory about Ankita and Boyan and when they lose their scholarships and what's on the line, then you actually enrich the context in a way such that it's not impossible to interpret knows in its first occurrence relative to one standard of precision and knows in its second elided occurrences relative to another standard. So once again, so to wrap up the survey of motivations and more ordinary language judgments, not the complicated quantified Bo-Jackson sentence, it seems like, okay, clever contextualism's doing better than the two big rivals. So the problem for the interest relative invariantist is that they incorrectly assimilate 15 and 17. So they miss out on assimilating 15 and 16. And the problem for the simple contextualist actually is that they can't predict that 18b sounds okay. So DeRose, for instance, says, yeah, I'll predict the badness of 18a. Like, I'll tell you why it can never be that A knows something and B doesn't and B has better evidence. It's because we're just going to deny binding. So whatever knows means in the first occurrence, it means the same thing in the second. And knows just can't shift. I mean, DeRose actually does think this. It can't shift its denotation mid-sentence. But I think the problem with taking that kind of hard line is that that semantic strategy overgenerates. So it's a little bit too draconian to say, oh yeah, knows is an indexical that can't shift mid-sentence, because it commits DeRose to this, I think, I mean, a bit of a bullet to bite. So I think DeRose has to deny intuitive claims like 18b that were really the engine of some interest relative invariantist arguments. So clever contextualism gets to accept the goodies that were motivating each independent rival's views. That's sort of the upshot of section 4. Yeah, Jaime.
I'm having trouble getting my intuitions right.
Yeah.
But I feel an asymmetry between 18b and 19b. I feel like very strong. Well, I mean, I'm not a native speaker, so it might be that, but even when I translate it, it sounds bad. So that's happened to be like a problem for what you were saying. But I was also thinking that you also mentioned that you don't think that tall works exactly like knows. So I was wondering, maybe you can account for that asymmetry by appealing to the specific way in which these two different expressions are context sensitive, or something that maybe you don't feel the intuition, or I don't know.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, I feel like actually, so when you say they're asymmetric, I take it you think 19b is more acceptable than 18b?
Actually, the opposite.
Opposite. Oh, okay. Woo!
Yeah, but maybe I'm alone. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's actually kind of. So 18b sounds more compelling. 19b sounds a little odd to you because you're thinking.
I think when I get convinced by the case of difference in what is at stake, like if I get convinced that that's a relevant difference, I can directly accept 18b. That's what I think. But of course, I accept the other. In the case of tall, it's clear that But even if I accept that it's okay to call Mary Sophie tall in one context, and it's not okay to call Spud not tall in different contexts. Even if I buy that story, I don't feel like I should accept 19b. I think that's a clearer picture of what the way I was processing.
Yeah, cool. What do you think about the sentence? If I could just investigate your intuitions for a minute. What do you think about a case where Marie Sophie and Spud are children who are the same height? They're both like 3 feet tall, and Marie Sophie is a kindergartner and Spud is a teenager. So then do you so Marie Sophie is tall, Spud isn't, and they're the same height. How does that sound to you?
A little bit better, I think.
Yeah, good. Okay. So there's this interesting kind of question, like you're hearing binding when I change tall to like tall for her age, but you resist the binding when I get to tall for her sport. And I actually think that's legit. And there's something actually that it's like, I do think there's something there that's a very interesting phenomenon about like how the tall for her age, tall for her sport, and then like maybe in between them actually is tall for the, somebody was actually pushing like we have a grad student, Ariana, who was saying she feels like when she moved to the United States, she became short because she was tall for one country and not tall for another country. So then that was kind of in between. Like, I don't know how you find that. Like, yeah.
Let's see. So then it might be what I said at the beginning. There might be details about the way tall is context sensitive that might explain the different.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I wish I had a good theory of when we find it easier and harder to bind, but unfortunately I don't. Like, it's just this huge open question that it's like an itch that I haven't managed to scratch. I don't understand. Yeah. I haven't got a great grasp on like, but I basically think if you hear tall for her age much more easily than tall for her sport, you're not alone. Like, I think there's this genuine range of judgments. And then, I mean, it's interesting because like, I think there are a lot of really subtle features about how we think of the different adjectives working that end up coming into play. Like, I think tall for one's country, or tall for the comparison class of like people in the same country as you, as opposed to people on the same sports team as you. Like, I don't think there's some non-pragmatic difference that's like going to be semantically encoded in tall that distinguishes those, but I'm not sure how to spell out like what the relevant pragmatic facts are that affect whether you hear it or not. Like, it's, yeah, I don't know. But whatever they are, I think they're there for tall, and then one would expect they're also there for nose, like making it harder or easier to hear the bound readings of nose for her purposes in different contexts. Yeah.
So probably what you need is that the kind of comparison classes that make 19b acceptable bear some similarity to the kind of standards that are required for nose. So in that sense, the acceptable reading of 18b and the acceptable reading of 19b are kind of, they have the same explanation. Does that make sense?
I mean that would be super great. Yeah, But unfortunately, like, I don't have an explanation of either, really. Like, I mean, I think they're really interesting phenomena that I don't have great explanations for, so I can't really argue, like, yeah, I mean, but hopefully, like, if one explains them both, then the explanations will look the same. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I think it's really interesting, this kind of pressure, and I am like genuinely worried. I think there is this kind of way to push back against my vindication of 18b, which is kind of brought out in your comments. Like, you say, look, like, I just could get convinced that knowledge is this interest relative thing. And so you could really dig in your heels and say, no, look, I'm going to say my intuition is that, like, there really is this thing, knowledge. And first she has it and then she loses it because the stakes go up. Or there's this relation that she has to this proposition, and the other guy, he doesn't have that relation to the proposition. And if you're willing to say, look, that's my intuition, I think I'm not going to vindicate those more, like, I mean, to me, it's a kind of an open question whether how much one should care about vindicating them, because it looks a little bit like, well, okay, these are no longer really ordinary language intuitions, but they're just kind of reassertions of a sort of consequence of interest relative invariantism. So what I'm trying to do is, like, maybe not convince the diehard interest relative invariantist who just says, no, look, like, I think there's just this relation and it goes away when the stakes go up. But rather, maybe I'm trying to convince, like, everyone who's in the middle ground, who reads the Ankita and Boyan examples and thinks, oh man, yeah, actually, that's kind of convincing. I do kind of want to say 18b. And if you're, yeah, so I guess I'm trying to appeal to someone who finds 18b compelling, but doesn't have strong additional feelings about why they think it's true. Yeah, so.
Right, thank you.
Yeah. This is so fun. Okay. Any other questions or? Yeah.
I have a comment on the same example, 19b.
Yeah.
Because I am thinking of that the comparison between knowledge and tool is not so clear. But if I think about sharpness, so for example, if I say this knife is sharp and this scalpel is not, even though the scalpel is sharper than the knife.
Yeah, good.
I get immediately the reading which in the binding.
That's awesome. Okay, good. Thanks, Victor. That's good. So, and I think that is a little, maybe that's a bit closer. Yeah, I'm basically trying to write this whole paper without taking a stand on any particular contextualist semantic theory of knows. And I realize that's, like, aggravating, but good if sharp is, yeah, what do you think? Yeah, Jaime, is the sharp sentence better to you than the tall sentence?
It is, yeah. And I was thinking about this. There's this distinction between absolute and relative gradable adjectives.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wonder whether that's doing some work, maybe.
Yeah,
because
yeah,
tall
yeah,
is like relative, and the other sharp. I'm not totally sure. It might be modeled as an absolute.
Yeah, I actually think that's right. I think basically what's happening is, like, sharp is this kind of maximal absolute gradable adjective, which is really similar in its semantics to, like, the kind of standards of precision loose speech-ish account, which is what I'm actually more drawn to when I think about the semantics of knows. So I feel like the maximal standard absolute adjectives, I mean, yeah, like, I should just start kind of using those instead of tall. I mean, it can't hurt to give something that's actually, like, closer in addition to just analogous. Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the simple contextualist cannot account for the acceptability of 18b. And I'm not so sure why. Couldn't she say that there's a change in the context in the middle of the sentence or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you don't typically get like, Ankita ate breakfast today, Boyan didn't, and then today gets to, the word today gets to take a different value and it's implicit. I mean, okay, so sorry, there's like there's a sort of first pass answer and then there's a second pass answer. First pass answer is often we don't see pure indexicals like shifting, so it would be a bit of an ad hoc story to say like, well, no, like in this case, let's just say it's a pure indexical and the context shifts, when that's not the normal behavior for pure indexicals, where it might be the normal behavior for things like tall and sharp. But real deep answer is actually DeRose. He kind of picked pure indexicals specifically as the thing that wouldn't shift, because dialectically, like, he really didn't want to vindicate sentences like, I know that I've got hands and I don't know that I'm a brain in a vat. Like, he just couldn't stand for those to be like simultaneously vindicated, because he wanted to say, oh, well, those conjunctions are really abominable and my theory predicts why. How does my theory predict it? Because my theory says nose doesn't shift. So I kind of think the contextualists like got off on the wrong foot because they wanted abominable conjunctions to be super abominable. And they wanted to like semantically legislate their abominability rather than say, well, pragmatically, it would be really weird to have the context shift mid-sentence in that particular conjunction. So what I'm really addressing, whether or not you think you could kind of finesse it on DeRose's behalf, the real DeRose and co are the people who, like, my real opponent would be people who say, oh, I want to semantically legislate against shifting in order to ensure that abominable conjunctions can't be true in any context. Does that make sense?
I see. Yeah.
It's like a more subtle dialectic. Yeah, good. Man, I feel like time is flying. And even though the last section looks short on the handout, it's quite long. Okay, so let me, I mean, especially because Nurit was interested, I just want to say a few words about why one needn't be bothered by being a clever contextualist instead of accepting deep encroachment. So so the fan of encroachment likes knowledge action links. There are a gazillion different knowledge action links in the literature. And so it can be helpful to just focus our attention on one specific view that might motivate encroachment, that says some action of a kind is constitutively tied to whether someone knows. And so my favorite example of this kind of knowledge action link actually arises in legal theory. So that's the little example I'm going to focus on, but then at the end, I just want to zoom out and say, yeah, who cares? Let's all be contextualists. So the knowledge norm for action that I'm interested in is 20 on the handout. So it's actually a knowledge norm for convicting a defendant. So you're on a jury. So a judge or jury, that's the fact finder. And I'm saying you should convict a defendant if and only if you know that the defendant's guilty on the basis of the evidence that was admitted at trial. So I defend this particular knowledge norm for conviction in a bunch of other papers, but just very quickly, like one thing that's supposed to get you in the spirit of accepting it is if you think about cases where you have merely statistical evidence that somebody's guilty. So 25 people are in a prison yard and 24 of them, this is not my example. It's Charles Nesson from 79. So it's, forgive that it's antiquated, but 24 of the 25 gang up and they kill the prison guard. And the example, this kind of classic story, is that the only evidence available is just very distant observation from some tower where they can't tell apart the 24 prisoners who were part of this conspiracy to murder from the one remaining innocent prisoner. And nevertheless, the local prosecutors just randomly pick somebody from the yard and bring that person to trial for participating in the attack. And it's supposed to think, you're supposed to think, well, look, like obviously some random person, this is not sufficient evidence to convict them. Like you have 0.96 credence that they're guilty, but that, I mean, you might have 0.96 credence that someone's guilty in a case where it would be acceptable to convict them. But in this case, your 0.96 isn't good enough. Like mere justified high credence and guilt is not good enough. Why? Well, because it's like a lottery case. It's like, oh, 25 tickets in a lottery and like 24 of them lose, but you wouldn't say that you know your ticket lost the lottery. So similarly, what you really need in order to convict somebody is just knowing that they did it. So the problem is, if you're a juror, so let's just run with this norm, this knowledge norm 20, and you're subject to this norm, convict if and only if you know the defendant's guilty, then you could ask, just for sake of argument, whoa, what if knowledge is subject to pragmatic encroachment? So whether you know the person is guilty now depends on what's at stake if they're convicted. That actually seems, well, pretty compelling. Like if pragmatic encroachment is true, actually a lot of substantive claims will follow. Like for one thing, if whether I know this defendant is guilty depends on whether he's, you know, let's suppose I convict and that means that this person spends life in prison as opposed to 20 hours of community service, you might think, well, more evidence should be required to convict someone who's facing life without parole. Why? Well, because you have to know they're guilty in order to convict, and to know they're guilty in a really high stakes case might take more evidence. So an upshot of pragmatic encroachment on knowledge would be that the criminal standard of proof, what constitutes proof beyond a reasonable doubt, it actually is going to increase and require more evidence in cases where the stakes of false conviction would increase. Another upshot of pragmatic encroachment on knowledge would be that we should start telling juries what's at stake so that they understand what kind of role they're being asked to play, like what's required of them, so that they understand 20. Basically, it would be helpful if juries knew whether somebody was facing 20 hours of community service or life in prison if convicted. So in the States, this is just, yeah, for those of you who don't know very much about like this, this field of study, the states have like very harsh mandatory minimum sentences. So just repeat offender laws like 10, 20 life and 3 strikes laws. So the idea is that actually in some cases, like the jurors could be massively ignorant of what's at stake when someone's convicted. So there are cases where, you know, someone's shoplifting batteries and because it's a 3rd conviction and they have 2 prior felonies. In one case in California from the 90s, somebody was convicted for shoplifting batteries and then spent 25 years in prison. So a case where you might not, as a juror, have any clue about what's at stake would be an example of a kind of case where you might be completely in the dark about what this knowledge standard of conviction requires. Okay, so we have a knowledge action link, a knowledge norm for conviction in particular. And it looks like pragmatic encroachment now has these very serious consequences, intuitive consequences for how juries should function, like more evidence to convict when the stakes are high, and juries should be informed of the consequences of conviction. So it looks like, oh, if pragmatic encroachment is true, this is a very big deal. Now, what I want to suggest is Actually, not really. Like, suppose for sake of argument that knowledge is not subject to pragmatic encroachment. Suppose that the clever contextualist is correct. Then let's go back and look at the knowledge norm for conviction 20 on the handout. A fact finder should convict a defendant if and only if they know the defendant's guilty on the basis of evidence admitted at trial. Well, okay, the natural reading for the clever contextualist of the norm 20 is going to be the bound reading. It's going to say something like, it's analogous to the norm, hey, buy local produce, where local just means local to you, wherever you are. A fact finder should convict a defendant only if they know, by the standard appropriate to the stakes in their case, that the defendant is guilty. So the standard for the clever contextualist for our interpretation of no in 20 is bound. And so now with that in mind, let's go back. And so as a clever contextualist, I'm saying, great, I accept this knowledge norm on conviction. I just accept this kind of bound reading of it. And moreover, it's not like this kind of cheap, trivial norm. Accepting the bound reading actually still has the very substantive consequences that the fan of encroachment thought 20 had. So, for instance, 21, in trials where more is at stake, the standard of proof will be higher. So that still holds like before. So the contextualist says, yeah, it'll take more for jurors in a capital case to know than in a case that's not one where the defendant might face the death penalty if convicted. In just the same sense that, yeah, it takes more for a basketball player to be tall. So that's a bound reading of, there's a bound vindication of 21. And so upshot 22, oh, should we as jurors really be told what's at stake if the defendant's convicted? So yeah, this is just part of this epistemology, legal epistemology paper I'm working on. I'm really arguing for this reform in the criminal justice system that currently, like, American jurors are in the dark about the stakes, but I think they shouldn't be. And actually the clever contextualist can say, I agree, they should not be in the dark. It's really important for jurors to know what's at stake when they're deciding whether to convict. That upshot holds. It's a little bit like if I say, hey, everyone, stay after sports practice today at high school, if and only if you're short. So if I announce that over the loudspeaker, that's the rule to follow, and you don't know what sport you're playing, like whether you're actually at gymnastics or basketball practice, then it's going to be hard for you to really understand what I tell you when I say, hey, by the way, stay after only if you're short. So similarly, like, it's really hard for jurors to follow this norm. Convict only if you know, if they have no idea what it takes for them to know that the defendant that they're that's on trial in their case is guilty. So I think basically when it comes to the knowledge norm 20, this knowledge norm for conviction, I think both the contextualist and the interest relativist can embrace all of these. They basically embrace counterpart norms of action that then generate all the same substantive judgments and consequences. So that's my little case study for why one particular bit of infighting between contextualists and interest relativists, at the end of the day, cheap versus deep encroachment, who cares? Actually, either one will get you a lot of substantive, cool legal consequences. And so I think in general, like, if you really are drawn to this idea that we want theoretical connections between knowledge and action, then I think that you can get a lot of what you want out of a kind of clever contextualist view. Yeah, so that's why, actually, this goes back to why I call the paper this contextualist reframing of encroachment. I want to I want to actually just end by saying, like, there's this kind of satisfying contextualist counterparts of even the knowledge norms of action that we're getting the encroachment ball rolling. Yeah. Oh, thanks. Silent clapping hands.
I think Gabby's having trouble with his internet. So I can take questions in case anybody has. any
I have a
questions.
question. Okay. So I was wondering about whether we can generalize this kind of equivalence that you are generating between the pragmatic, the epistemic pragmatic principles, like the one about convicting and knowledge, to other cases that are not legal, because like the original cases of knowledge action principles are more like necessary conditions for knowledge, like, you know, that P only if you're rational to act as if P, or you're justified in belief that P only if you're rational to prefer as if P, or something like that. So does your account can make room for these other principles that are not, that are pragmatic principles but are not like the legal ones?
Yeah, good. So yeah, I think so. So what I want to say is that, like, let's take somebody who says, like, you know, if you have this practical decision, like a bet, for instance, on super high stakes, such that if not P is true, you should do one thing, and if P is true, you should do another. So then you have, like, you're facing something where P, conditionalizing on it, actually changes your preference for what to do. Like, that's a very kind of traditional knowledge action principle. And then the idea is, well, look, in that kind of case, you can't just know that, let's see. So the idea is supposed to be, well, as soon as not P becomes like really practically relevant, it's going to be also like an epistemically relevant alternative. Like, all the practically relevant ones get to count as like the epistemically, like, Lewis contextualism relevant alternatives. But yeah. It's interesting because I feel like what I'm thinking is, hey, they are Lewis relevant alternatives, and I'm David Lewis, like, I'm a contextualist. Like, I'm gonna actually say that everyone, in order to know by the standards, like, in order to know sub U, you have to eliminate the alternatives that are practically relevant sub U, YOU, but like where those are bound. Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. I like that you're, I mean, it is like a little idiosyncratic that 20 happens to be this biconditional, where normally, like, no one's interested in giving those kinds of biconditionals. It's more like a sufficient condition for being an epistemically relevant alternative. So then that's like a necessary condition on knowledge. Yeah, that's really cool. I hadn't thought about checking to make sure. I mean, I think that I'm just developing counterparts for everything, every kinds. Yeah, both directions of each biconditional. Or yeah.
Good.
So I have one tiny question. I don't know if I can ask. I'm just having a curiosity here because I'm just learning about these new topics. So isn't it possible that if knowledge is dependent on the interest of the speaker. Isn't there a possible case in which interests are that low that we end up calling knowledge to a lot of counterintuitive cases? So are these cases? So I'm just trying to see, the limits of such an approach.
Yeah, good. There's one interesting, when you say like knowledge and then the interest of the speaker, so usually people will say like, oh, the interest relative view makes knowledge vary according to the interests of the subject of the ascription. So just when I say like, oh, Jones knows that P, it's Jones's interests that are relevant. And then there's this further question though, I think, just when you're thinking this through, there's a question about whether Jones actually has epistemic access to the interests that count as hers for the purposes of interest relativism. And I'm inclined, I mean, what bothers me about some interest relativists is that I think the stakes can go up for a subject without that subject knowing it. So all of a sudden, she loses a bunch of money in the stock market, doesn't know it. Now it's really important that she makes the mortgage where it wasn't important before. And if you really wanted initially, like if you were driven to say, oh, stakes can matter, you don't know because now the stakes are high and before they were low, you want to be really careful to even say, oh, it's Jones' interests that go from low to high or vice versa. You want to be careful to not, to make that relation loose enough that her interests can be something that she doesn't even have access to. Yeah, I don't know if that's helping you.
Yeah, that paints a picture of what I was imagining. But thanks so much for that example. That gives me direction to explore.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. John Hawthorne and Charity Anderson have this paper basically arguing that, I mean, just to really turn your head for a spin, like arguing that actually bunch of philosophers say that stakes are high, stakes are low, but if you ask them what stakes are, like what goes into the calculation of stakes, nobody has a good answer. It actually is just bogus. Like stakes is like phlogiston, like there's nothing there that could, they argue, really do the work that philosophers are wanting stakes to do. So that's disturbing. Like I've been talking as if there's such a thing as stakes and we can responsibly like theorize using that concept. But yeah, like at the end of the day, it's another open question, how well we can do at like making good at the notion of someone's interests changing. I mean, at least at a first pass, one needs to really put pressure on the idea that stakes are unidimensional. Like I have a bunch of different interests, and yet here's Keith Thoreau saying high stakes, low stakes, as if everything's just quantifiable in terms of some, I don't know, we make it commensurable and everything's just measured in dollar amounts, but, or utils. That's probably not how stakes or epistemic standards should be arranged. So just to further like say, if you feel like, oh, there are lots of complicated foundational questions here, like I agree. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Well, I think we're already at time. So unless anybody hasn't spoken yet, has a question, this is your last chance. But okay, otherwise, thank you, Sarah, for being here. Y gracias a todos y todas por habernos acompañado en estas sesiones del seminario de verano. Nos vemos en unos meses con otros seminarios más.
Yeah, thanks so much for organizing.
Señor Eder, ya podemos cortar la transmisión. I think we're trapped in Facebook in like a limbo of being live. But yeah, we can leave this Zoom link.
Got it. And there's the second one that is an email.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I will find that one.
Awesome.
Quizás nosotros podemos manualmente desde la página de Teorema.
No sé cómo, sí, no sé cómo cortarlo.
Ya se fue.